Democrats are in dire need of a serious postmortem, but thankfully for us, they don't have the wherewithal for it, because it would mean parting ways with one of their most fundamental lies, the notion that man can act as God and create reality for himself, thereby rewriting the morality underpinning right and wrong and recasting those values as self-serving tools. Basically, that's why they love transgenderism so much, because they can pretend that biological reality isn't real, and they love abortion because it means they can be the arbiter over life and death. You get the point. The best attempt at a postmortem that I've seen so far comes from Vanity Fair, which just published this piece by James Pogue. But in it, Pogue comes off as speaking into the void at a party drunk on its own Kool-Aid and not wanting to sober up and to face reality. Again, thankfully for us. Pogue writes about the warning signs for the 2024 presidential election, which were clearly on display at the DNC convention that August in Chicago. This excerpt I'm about to read for you is a little long, but I think it really sets the tone for the whole piece. It reads, quote, "It was the hottest ticket in Chicago, designed to spawn 1,000 pieces about what the party meant. 2,000 people RSVP'd. I'm not kidding when I say this is the best political party I've ever been to," the anti-gun youth activist David Hogg told a reporter. This is where Gen Z is. He was speaking at the Hotties for Harris event, held at a polished warehouse space midway through the Democratic National Convention last August. When I got there around midnight, a giant screen displayed floating images of Tim Walz's head, and hundreds of free condoms reading F Project 2025 were scattered and discarded all over the floor. At least a couple hundred people were still dancing. Every third person was wearing one of those ubiquitous camouflage Harris Waltz caps that had become an unlikely fashion item for Brown and Oberlin graduates working to elect a ticket that pundits and consultants seem to believe might capture a serious slice of votes from America's hunting and fishing dads. Democratic Party girls, as Claudia Conway, the 19-year-old daughter of George and Kellyanne Conway, described herself, and TikTokers with millions of followers like Maddie Westbrook have been invited by the score. Off to the back was a little purpose-built room with a display of free birth control, a wall of weirdos displaying photos of Republican officials, and a wall of so-called hotties who supported Harris, like Beto O'Rourke, Jason Kelsey, and Elizabeth Warren. Their portraits all framed and washed from overhead in the lime green brat hue that seemed, at least for a little bit, like it might soon ride a wave of good feelings all the way to the Oval Office, end quote. Do you see the problem? Okay, there's a lot of problems, but do you see this problem? The party is drunk on licentiousness and hedonism. And since an ever-expanding bureaucratic state likes to keep people enslaved to their vices, the state merged almost completely with the Democratic left during Biden's time in office. The state wants you to be atomized by sin so that the government becomes your God and your family and your friend and your employer and your everything. While the left wants those same things, but because they think that is what freedom is all about. When conservatives know that freedom is not the end in itself, but it's only the means by which we attain higher goods, like right worship of God and the intellectual pursuit of truth. Now, keep that in mind when thinking about the leftward drift of government, which is now thankfully being reversed by President Trump. But that leftward drift of the institutions means that the left finds itself in the precarious situation of now needing to defend the very institutions they used to undermine. Pogue addresses this by observing, quote, "Democrats had brought together everyone from leftists to neoconservatives, a Sanders-Harris-Cheney coalition," as the Washington Post reporter Jeff Stein put it, in a popular front to defend democracy. But in an era when 60% of Americans believed our democracy needed major changes, it looked to many voters like this coalition represented a well-off and well-educated establishment interested in preserving a status quo many regular Americans had come to despise. For the first time in modern history, the party would end up winning a majority of affluent voters and losing a majority of voters making less than $50,000 a year. Democrats, by dint of standing in opposition to a populist insurgency, had started to morph into what looked like America's establishment, end quote. Throughout this extremely long piece, Pogue tries to make this case to top Democrats who either ignore his warnings, shrug them off, or who are too enamored with their own power to care. Again, remember, this piece was released after Inauguration Day, but was about events happening before the election, back when many Democrats thought it wasn't possible for Trump to win because he'd be behind bars. It was interesting to me that when Pogue finally tracked down Congressman Jamie Raskin, famous on the left for going after Trump about January 6th, he tied himself into pretzels by trying to argue that the national security state has been a threat to civil liberties, specifically to those of opposing political movements like the left and black nationalists back in the day, going back many decades, but that somehow, in this one instance, the national security state was acting completely responsibly and totally not in a partisan or corrupt manner in going after Trump, his associates, or even his regular everyday supporters. Again, those bizarre arguments feel hollow and they fall on deaf ears. Are these institutions corrupt or are they not? What people instead see is a Democrat Party willing to criticize the ruling order only when they're on the outs. But the moment they become the ones in charge, they become worse than the conservative ruling order they used to criticize. It's similar to how the Marxists in Russia used to complain about the Tsar, only to come to power with the birth of the Soviet Union, where they promptly became far, far, far worse than anything the Tsar's ruling class had ever been.